Right. Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, A Common Thread, curated by Karen Peterson and Shar Norman. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist, Linda Leviton. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode. Feel free to utilize that chat function to ask your questions, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there might be some variation of bandwidth. So if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome, Linda.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank the Rife Center for inviting me to speak today, to Kat Sheridan and her staff, to Karen Peterson and Shar Norman, who curated the show, and especially to Sue Kavanaugh, who inspired me. So here we go. So what was my inspiration? Well, a lot of it was family influence. From a young age, my grandmother and my mother worked at a thrift store, and I used to love to go to the thrift store when they were working and when they weren't working and find vintage clothes that I would wear to school, and sometimes I would change them up. But I also had twin aunts, Pat and Joan, recently just passed away this last year. They were also my inspiration. They loved clothes. They both made clothes. My Joan, the one sitting down, knitted, and the one standing up, she actually got a sewing machine and made a lot of her own clothes, but they were very high fashion ladies. I went to school at the University of Cincinnati, and what I really wanted to do was to go to art school, but my father said, no, you got to graduate and be able to have a job. So the closest thing I could find was graphic design, which they had at the University of Cincinnati in a work study program, which was a 5-year program. So after freshman year, every 3 months, I moved away from Cincinnati and got a job in another town. I worked at a photo studio, I worked at a corporate office, I worked at a publishing firm, and it was great experience, but not exactly the regular college experience that everyone would have, because I really only connected with my graphic design class, moving back and forth all the time. I graduated summa cum laude, and after I graduated, I decided I was going to go to New York and look for a graphic design job, which I did. But I happened to go during a garbage strike, and carrying my portfolio in the subway and on the bus back and forth, leaving my portfolio for 5 hours while they looked at it before they'd grant me an interview, and coming back and interviewing to me was kind of rough. And after a week of that, I had a job offer, but I declined, and I went home, and I had a dream about going to Chicago, and I went to Chicago, and the end of that week, I had a job. My first job was at American Hospital Supply Corporation, and pretty much you worked on an 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17 format, because most of the graphic design was print. I was very, very frustrated just working on this small format. So on the weekends, I would pull out my vintage clothes and fabric, and I would start making wall hangings and pillows. You can see in that art, very poor photo of me sitting at an art fair, and I had found a trunk of gloves, and I made all kinds of artwork out of those gloves. And then you can see 2 other pieces. One was a vintage dress that was shredded and stuffed and put on an old piece of upholstery fabric, and the other was a sailor suit on coat lining that I painted. But this was very fun. So I would just do this on the weekends. So I had at least 11 apartments and 12 jobs while I was in Chicago. I kept on getting bored with the job and trying to find another job that was more interesting. And in the meantime, I got married, had 2 kids. My husband started a business, and we moved to Indianapolis. So in Indianapolis, I was freelancing. With 2 little kids, I'd go pick up jobs at the end of the day, do them at night, and deliver them back to the agencies in the morning. And then once in a while I'd have a bigger job, but um, I was very frustrated, and I would wait months to get paid on a job, especially if it was a big job, or depending whatever the agency was going through. And I wanted something that I could do and get paid immediately. So I signed up for massage school, and I took massage school 3 nights a week and did my freelance work after that, and had these two little kids and a husband that traveled, and I was kind of beside myself. I didn't know what to do because I wasn't loving the massage school either. I seemed to be picking up everything that everybody had at the school. And so I talked to a counselor, and while I was talking to the counselor, he asked me, what didn't I like about being a graphic designer? And I said, well, I just feel like I'm a pair of hands. And he said, well, what is it when you're a massage therapist? And I said, I guess I'm another pair of hands. And he says, well, what do you really want to do? And I said, I really want to be an artist. And I said, but he says, so why aren't you an artist? And I said, because I grew up my whole life with everybody telling me you can't make a living as an artist. And he said, I'm telling you, you can make a living as an artist. So this piece was half finished, and I felt like I had to finish it. And then I wrote on the frame of this piece a phrase that he gave me. He said, there's no escape, there's only resolution. You're going to keep on repeating the same energy over and over again unless you resolve what that was from. So that's what I did. So I began to like experiment with materials. At first, I started taking my clothing like I was doing at the art fair, hardening it and spraying it to look like metal. And then I took a class at a local community college called Ivy Tech that taught trades. And I took industrial welding and learned like 4 different kinds of welding, and decided I was better with a torch. And I started going to the junkyard, and there was copper wire, there was copper screening, there were electronic parts, and I'd bring these home and I would make artwork from them. So these are 3 pieces from that time. I actually took these pieces and had a show in Chicago at Artemisia Gallery. But the piece on the left, the Phantom, I put all my work in a U-Haul on the back of my minivan. And by the time I got to the show, it had totally vibrated apart. That's when I decided I really needed to learn how to do something stronger. So I went to the welding shop, and the guy there showed me a welding stick that was self-fluxing, meaning I didn't have to clean the metal, and it was 10% silver solder, and that transformed my construction. We moved to Columbus at the very end of 1993, and this is when I totally said goodbye to all my graphic design clients, because I was still doing both in Indianapolis. And one of the first pieces I made was this piece called There Is No Separation in All That Exists. I got some rocks from a landscaping company, River Rocks, and I cut all the mass for the stones, and I took them to a monument place, and I had them sandblast all the words in the stone. I wrote a poem, and each word from the poem, there's a poem inside the phrase, there is no separation. So you can see on the lower right-hand corner how there were words, passport to our next life. And then I signed the piece on the last stone. And the other piece on the right was, I was just experimenting with so many different materials. I had somebody blow glass eggs. This was a nest that I made out of twisted copper wire with chandelier crystals on a wood branch with copper leaves. And that was actually a commission to somebody who lived in New York who wanted to cover a crack in our ceiling. So you could see through the bottom of the nest in the crystals and see these eggs glowing inside. One year, the American Craft Council decided to do a show in Columbus, and I went down and I met another artist who did copper wall sculpture, and he told me about a mentoring program with the American Craft Council where they would pay your booth fee and you had to make the art and, install it and, run the show. Well, I really knew very little about how to do an indoor high-end craft show. And my first craft show was so intimidating. It was at McCormick Place in Chicago. And you could not touch your artwork. You had to have the union had to move everything and install everything for you, which was crazy. And you had to pay them their hourly rate. So it was a very expensive show, even though my booth was free. But while I was there, these are the two things that actually jump-started me at having a business. One was learning about the Guild Source Book. There was a representative at that show at McCormick Place selling pages to artwork of this hardbound book that was sent to galleries, architectural firms, and art consultants and interior designers all over the country for free. And you could buy a page in this book for the low price of $1,000. And I decided to try it. It was a lot of money because I hadn't been selling very much work. And I went ahead and it was one of the best decisions I ever made. I started buying 2-page spreads and then they made me the representative to talk to other artists to get them to sign up to put work in this book. Anyway, on the 20th, I advertised in this book for a number of years, and on their 20th year, they actually took one of my pieces and used it on the cover here. The other thing that jump-started my resume was being accepted in a show called Diversity with the Art Quilt Alliance. I think it's the SAQA, Studio Art Quilt Alliance. They're still active today, but this was, there was a magazine called Calendar for Artists that listed shows all over the country. I saw this, it said, make a quilt. I made a quilt out of roof tear-off. And you'll see that this is the piece, that's the same piece that's here on the postcard. Every artist had a postcard. It was put in this box, and that was the catalog for the show. So it was like a 9-patch quilt. You can see 9 squares with different colors. And the roof tear-off had a acid rain patina on it, which accepted paint really well. And then I would sand off the edges of each square. So this was really key in me learning how to work with metal, that you can't just put paint or color directly on the metal. You have to do some kind of a chemical bond with the metal. And that was the acid rain that would accept a paint. So I was very inspired and excited and wanted to enter more American Craft Council shows. You had to be juried in. And so I just went back to my studio and just tried a lot of different things. And these were all kind of based, you got to remember I was a graphic designer. And so I was, really tied into the grid because our schooling was all about developing a grid and designing from a grid. So I started with the quilt format. So the pieces on the upper left-hand side were done with a technique called fold forming, where you fold the metal, unfold the metal, and you get a dimensional line in the metal. But I was cutting crazy shapes. I was riveting them. I was brazing them. I was welding frames and starting to use a lot of different techniques. Whoops. Oh, it's not letting me forward.
It's a little bit further to the left.
Oops.
Aunt Linda.
Yeah, here, I think I can do this.
And yeah, you can also just use your, yep.
Thank you. Thanks. So I learned this technique, fold forming, from a class I took at Arrowmont School of Crafts in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I met a man named Charles Luton Brain, who in grad school developed a way of forming metal quickly by heating the metal, making it soft, folding it, hammering it with a leather mallet, taking another kind of hammer, either hammering the edge or the outer edge or different techniques of hammering, heating the metal, opening it up again, and getting a beautiful shape. And so these pieces were all made with fold forming, and these were pieces that I entered into a show in Chicago. The Spertus Museum, which was a Jewish museum that had a religious object show every year, every other year, depending on where they were going with it. So the top left is a Seder plate, then I have a spice box. The pomegranate pulls out of the gourd and it opens up, and you would have spice inside of that. Then there was Eve's leaves, a dress, and then a Miriam cup, which was a ceremonial cup during the Passover Seder. So one of my favorite places to thrift was the junkyard. And when I went to the junkyard, I found this colored wire in a bucket that was so beautiful. I went home and I spooled, it was like a rat's nest. I spooled it and I made the dress with the orange skirt and the green top for a show in New York called Off the Line. And everything you made had to hang on a rope that she ran through her gallery. And so I thought, well, I'm going to make a dress because, of course, I had dresses that was part of my vocabulary. So I found that I could go to the junkyard and actually find this on a spool. So you can see the spools on the right-hand side there, different colors I could find. And then I found in an industrial catalog places I could just order spools of different colors. The different colors are varnish on a copper wire, which represent a different gauge for each kind of motor that needed copper winding. Like if you open any kind of like a vacuum cleaner or a blender, you'll see a copper coil inside. And that's the wire that was used to make those motors. And people would get motors repaired, and these repair places would have all these different coils of wire in them. But I started doing a show in Chicago, a high-end craft show, and I made these shoes. The shoes went with the dresses. Every time I did a big inside convention craft show, I would make one of these dresses, which would be the item that would pull people into my booth. And I sold all but one. I kept one, which if anybody comes to my house, they can see it. I have it hanging in my bathroom with a pair of shoes under it. But this was all part of my Eve series. When I was doing the shows, I would make pieces that would hang in a 10 by 10 foot booth. And so I would make these like panels in the lower left. These were 2 by 3 feet. And somebody came by who was an art consultant and saw this and asked me to make this for a large lobby. Actually, it was one Shell Square in New Orleans for Shell Oil. And I made this piece. And by this time I had my bigger studio. So this is a shot in my studio on my big wall. So I had this wall I could work on to simulate where the piece was going to be. But I found that going from the small residential size to a more corporate size took a whole different way of fabricating things. So I had to figure out, how I was going to make this larger. It needed more bracing in the back. It needed, thicker backings. And so I started learning how to use a table saw and a router and drill press and all kinds of other, a brake, a metal brake, all kinds of different machinery at this time. So here's another example of a small piece that was called Pickup Sticks that another art consultant saw on my website and asked me to make it large for Wells Fargo in Dubuque, Iowa. Des Moines, Iowa. There's so many cities like that in Iowa. And I made this, it's 12 by 15 feet, you can see in the title, but it was made in 8 pieces. And I made it in 8 pieces because I knew that would fit in my van. And I made a rack in my van. I stacked this piece in my van and drove it out to Des Moines because I wasn't sure how well these things would ship. Actually, this piece needed angle iron on the back to keep it from warping. And that when you make a piece from small to large, you have to look at considerations like you don't know what the environment's going to be. You don't know if there's going to be direct sun on it. You don't know if, how well it's air conditioned. Is it overly air conditioned? Is there a lot of humidity? So there were a lot of things that I discovered that I needed to do to resolve having a piece hang permanently in a, corporate environment. So a man from Michigan State saw my piece on my website. I think he Googled copper, and my work came up because everything had copper in the title or the description, and wanted me to come and talk with his physics department at the National Superconducting Laboratory that they had up at Michigan State and make a piece of artwork for their new wing they were putting on the physics building, where they would have international people come for lectures, and one of them would stay and run experiments on the superconductor. So I went up there and I met all these physicists, and they took me for a tour of the machinery, or all this, like, it was huge. It was like in several rooms, this huge superconductor, and it had a huge copper drum on this piece. And this is why they picked me. They wanted a piece with copper. So I talked to them. I was trying to figure out what imagery could I possibly use, and I would look at like all their readouts when they conducted an experiment, like what their screens look like, and I tried to design something that had imagery like they would see on their screens. And I came back and they said, no, no, we look at that all day long. We don't want to see anything like that. We want something more conceptual. So I went back and I just started painting sheet after sheet after sheet and photocopying them and cutting them up and like assembling them. And I came up with this concept, windows within windows. So like on the first one, that yellow square could be a sunspot on the sun. And then the background would be the heat of the sun. And then the second one, you could see kind of a sky and then atmosphere and then green. That was like a view of the earth from outer space, looking down on the earth. And then you're looking at like a pond with reeds and something zooming along in the water. So I was just trying to go macro to micro in imagery and just make it more conceptual. So you can see how I'm working on this thing on the wall. It was actually doing 36 separate oil paintings and then putting braces on the back so that they could hang at an angle. And the installation was pretty complicated to figure out how all these squares were going to hang. But by this time I had my studio. The room I'm working in is 1,600 square feet. And I went to an auction for Columbus Public Schools when they were switching over all their like woodworking shops into computer labs. And they had these 5-foot square wood tables, and I bought the tabletops and I made movable bases for them. And these are the tables that I worked on in my studio. And you can see it's like I needed this huge studio to stick it up on the wall and to paint it and to figure out how to fabricate it. And you can see some of the metal equipment I have and, table saw and so forth in there that I needed to make this, because I would make wood squares, laminate copper, mask the copper. But before I put the copper on, I had to put the cleat on the back. So that all had to be worked out before I even painted it. It was just, it was complicated, but I did it. So somebody saw that piece I did for the National Superconducting Laboratory and said, we want that same piece in our lobby. Well, first of all, their lobby wasn't big enough to have the same piece. And I explained how I didn't like to repeat a piece. And they said, well, we really like that blue streak, that white streak in the blue. And could you include that in the piece? And I said, okay. So I went back to painting, and I would do all these small paintings and then I would assemble them and then This one was in Washington, D.C., and they told me it was going to be on a drywall, and we got there, and it was a marble wall, a white marble wall, which, let me tell you, it's nerve-wracking to install into stone because you can't just fill it and move it. So that was pretty challenging. I got a call from a corporate art dealer who worked for the government. And when you do a piece for the government, they usually go through all kinds of magazines and get inspiration pieces. And they sell the concept to whatever government agency is building their building, and then they need a percent for the art piece. And so they get a buy-off from the government through something that you haven't made. So they come to me and they say, we want a floral piece for this large hotel at Disney World that is just for government employees. And I said, okay. And I made a sketch that looks like the finished piece, but I really did not know exactly how I was going to make this. But I came up with a price, and it was probably way too low for all the work I had to do to it, but I like a challenge. So I sent in my bid. Like 2 years later, they called me and they said, well, we finally have approval for the budget and we want you to make the piece, but I don't think I told you this before, but every flower or leaf you make has to be something that grows in Florida. So then I had to do all this research about what flowers grew in Florida and what I actually thought I could fabricate. So on this next screen, you can see how I actually put this piece together. And Melinda Rosenberg, I don't know if she's on, but hey to Melinda here. She built the wood backing plate, which you can see I painted in copper. On the left, you see it in foam core, which was the model I made for Melinda. And I made a foam core, very low relief vase that would fit over all the attachments to put all these leaves in. And she was a doll. She made this for me. And so then I put it up on my wall and I started making leaves, and I just started layering it like I was a florist putting together a flower arrangement. And you can see I have all these little cuffs drilled in. Each piece had to have a stem so I could do an attachment on the backing board. And then I put the cover over it, and the cover got etched copper sheet over it, so it actually looked like a vase. Then that wasn't enough challenge. I had to ship it to Florida, and it was going to sit in a crate for a couple of months before they were going to install it. So I had to have a crate made that floated this piece inside the crate for shipping, because a few times I had things destroyed during shipping. This piece was inspired by a piece I did for the Akron Art Museum and a small piece I did for the Hilton Hotel downtown, where I made these quilts called circle quilts, and I would cut circles different diameters like 3, 4, and 5 inches. And then I would paint them. I'll show you a construction picture next. But this piece, this swoosh, was actually designed to be horizontal. And it was a concept I sent to a consultant out in California who didn't buy the concept. But I loved it. And I went ahead and made it for a show I had in Indianapolis. And I let this piece sit, I don't know, probably sat 4 years in my studio before somebody saw it on my website and wanted to buy it. So it went to Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. And this broke apart in 2 7-foot pieces so I could build a rack in the back of my van and drive it to Connecticut, because I thought it would not survive a shipping unless I had a very expensive crate made, of which, of course, I didn't have the budget for. So here's how I made it. In the upper left-hand corner is a machine from an old sheet metal shop called the Circle Cutter. It was made by Roper Whitney, and I found one at one of these industrial warehouses where when somebody closes their business, they sell all their machinery and then they try and resell it. So I found this circle cutter. It's like a huge can opener because it has two circular blades and a clamp. And the clamp is on a C thing that's a long C. So you can put in really big sheets of metal or small. So I could make a circle from 3 inches in diameter to like 40 inches in diameter with this thing. And it cut it pretty well, but um, it needed a lot of TLC to make it work. So I cut hundreds of circles in different sizes out of copper, and then I would cut them and make them like an umbrella shape, like a cone that you drink water out of. And those were riveted, and then I brazed a wire on the bottom point of it. And then I would sit them in a grid, and you can see on the right-hand side, I'd sit them in a grid and I would paint them with like different cups of color that would go into clear lacquer. And it was kind of like working with watercolors because they would blend. And then when I sprayed them with the clear coat, they would blend even more. And people thought I copper enameled all these circles, which I did not. But then I had to lay them out and figure out how I was going to make the color progression. But on the lower left-hand side, this is when I'm trying to estimate how many circles I actually need to make. So that thing is, I had 3 tables together for a 15-foot long surface to work on. But when I actually wired these things in, I had to make a vertical frame to hold these so I could look in the front and walk around to the back and wire them in. So one of my biggest sellers in the corporate world was my Patterns of Nature series, where I took a sheet of metal, I painted a resist on the front, spray painted the back solid, and left open parts exposed for an acid bath. So I would have a container where I would put these face down in the acid bath and have them etch. And I would do them one off. Each one was hand painted. And it got to the point where I couldn't hand paint them anymore because I got so many orders. I had to figure out a way of increasing my production. So I found an etcher in Ligonier, Indiana, who was willing to work with me. They had never worked with an artist before because what they did is they made electronic parts and thin little metal parts for machinery. And they were kind of excited to work with me. It took a while to work back and forth, and I had to buy pounds and pounds of metal to store at their facility. And then I'd order them. I'd say, give me 2 of pattern A, a pattern D, a pattern F, and a pattern G. I want them in copper, and I want you to use the 15 by 18-inch sheet. I'd have to specify all this stuff, and then they would do it, and they would ship the raw etched sheet to me, and then I would have to clean it, color it, sand it, clear coat it, trim it, and mount it on a frame. And I had somebody make the frames for me because, again, I couldn't keep up with all this. So I had I had templates. I made templates for this guy so he would know what kind of curve to make. I had a concave, convex, and S curve, and you can see all those shapes and different combinations on this wall. And the other wonderful thing about this series is it worked on a curved wall, because I can't tell you how many people called me and said, well, I need art for a curved wall. What can you do? So this was actually in a private residence out in San Clemente, California. The guy flew me in. I had scaffolding. I put paper up on the wall. I figured out what would look good. He approved it. I brought it back to the studio. I made everything, shipped it to a guy with the scaffolding. He put the scaffolding up, he installed the piece, and then he took it for me. So that's how I got that. Well, this series was very versatile. So on the left was a piece I did for a competition in Anderson Township outside of Cincinnati. This was a elevator structure, and there were stairs up around the winding around this piece to a second floor in a community center. and I built the frames to fit the facet of the tile on the column. And then somebody saw that and said, hey, I have this really long wall, but I don't have a really big budget. What can you do for the Federal Reserve? And so I spaced them out and did this long corridor out of these thin ribbons. I just called them ribbons. Then you can see another application on the left at Vanderbilt Hospital. The architect had spec'd this two-color wall, and the art consultant was having a conniption about how can I put art when you have stuck this big cross on the wall. And I gave her a number of options. First, she wanted me to cover up the cross. And I said, nope, you got to work with it. So I just came up with the 4 squares. And then it was great for a hospital because it had imagery on it, but nothing that anybody could attach any serious meaning to other than nature, flow, relaxation. So this was in the lobby of St. Mercy Hospital up in Michigan. So while I was on the hospital circuit, I got asked to make a piece for the Ross Hart Hospital here in at Ohio State, and somebody saw my leaf dress. And at first, they wanted me to make a leaf dress that looked like the symbol for the red dress, that looked like a dress kind of blowing in the wind that was popular in their marketing campaign. And I kind of said, well, how long are you going to have this marketing campaign? It's going to come and go, and then the piece will have to go. And so we decided just to go with a heart. And again, this was a big construction problem to solve. I made a frame that needed a lot of reinforcement, but I had to be able to get in behind it to tie all the leaves in. So I made these fold form heart-shaped leaves to make a heart, and they were sprayed with a very light pink tint in the lacquer onto the copper to keep it looking like a vibrant red heart. I did, every once in a while, I do a show, a weekend show, and I did one up in Michigan, and I had so much wall work, a space in the middle of my booth, and I needed something to sit on a pedestal. So I made these vessels. And somebody came by and said, oh, I love this, but can you make it to hang on the wall? So I took it home and I welded some circles on the base and sent it back to her, and she hung it on the wall, and it was really up high. But I came back to the studio saying, this could be a really great series I could do. And I'm sick of doing these patterns of nature pieces. I've made hundreds of them by now. So I came up with a pattern, and it had to be 4 inches or less for the Americans with Disabilities Act. You couldn't make a piece of art over 4 inches on the wall for safety reasons. So I could make these very shallow. I could make them, I had different sizes. I made them different colors. I made them in silver. I made them in copper. And I found a anodized aluminum that made it look like copper or stainless that was so much easier to work with. I cut these out with a jeweler's saw, riveted them together. I mean, I made ones that were like 36 inches big down to like 18 inches big. So I had a range of sizes and patterns I could do. Sometimes I made them wider, sometimes I made them skinnier and longer, and I could paint them and then clear coat them. And the metal stood out from where the piece was actually masked. This piece on the left is in Indianapolis. It was at a dental office that did, they did all kinds of things. And this was in their stairwell. This went down the stairs into the lower level. And I had them shift down into different colors as they went down the stairwell. So you're only seeing part of the stairwell there. Well, we all know about what happened like in 2007, 8, everything crashed, the real estate market crashed, and people were still establishing budgets for corporate art. Sometimes it would take years for them to be able to if when they were proposing a building, they would have art proposed for it and they would establish a budget then. So this echoed, I mean, this kind of went throughout the 2010, 14, 15, 16, 13, 12, projects that were decided way ahead of time. And I had to find a way to make big art for not big money. So I met a laser cutter in town and I went back to the graphic design illustrator and did some designs and had him laser cut them. And sometimes they were single layers like you see in the corridor. And once in a while I'd make a piece that had many layers that fit together like a puzzle, which was done for a chapel. Another one of my clients had a cancer hospital and she wanted to do a sculpture of a big cancer ribbon in the front lobby. And so she came to my studio and we looked at a bunch of different art. And I had a dress that was made like a wedding dress that was white loops. And we kind of looked at that together and she said, well, could we make a ribbon out of that loop? And I said, yeah, I could make a ribbon out of that loop. And I said, but it's going to be really boring. So you got to do something else to it. And so I came up with the idea of tying a ribbon in the ribbon. And each ribbon stood for a different kind of cancer. And somebody could come in and write their loved one's name on the ribbon and tie it in. And after a while, this looked like Snuffleupagus. It was so covered in ribbons that the receptionist would have to cull some of the ribbons off and to keep it looking nice. And I got a number of other jobs from this. Oh, no, let's see. No. Sorry, I'm out of order here. No, I guess I don't have that slide. I made this many different, sorry. I made this many different ways. I made heart-shaped ones, I made vertical ones, I made square ones, I made ones with really long loops that went down a hall. And so that was a pretty successful format. I was a finalist in a percent for the art for University of Wisconsin, their School of Design. There were 3 of us. We met with them. The panel, they said, well, we could have a piece in the lobby. We could have a wayfinding piece. We could have an interactive piece. You could do a piece in this glass glassed area we have. Go design something and propose it. So I proposed a piece for their glass curtain wall. Since this was the design building, I thought it should have something that really set it apart. And so this was my presentation, the drawing on the left. And then I made some sample pieces to show them what it would look like. I found this material at the Wexner Center. Another artist used this acrylic that had bonded dichroic film on it. So depending on what angle you were looking at it, it would reflect different colors. It would go from purple to blue to yellow, orange. And I thought this was a way, one of the things they wanted was an interactive piece, but the technology had to last 20 years. And I knew there was no technology that was going to last 20 years because everything was changing so quickly. So I decided to use a passive interactive material, which was this acrylic. So again, I based it on the quilt, and you can see different modules. You can see one that just, the whole 18-inch module is just one tent. They were like 45-degree angles. Another one just had 4 squares on it. Then there was one with 9 squares and one with 16 squares. So you can see all the different modules in that piece on the right-hand side. I ended up selling this mock-up in pieces to different consultants for smaller residential projects. Patterns of Nature had a very long life, and people started asking me to do donor walls, memorial walls, timeline walls, marketing walls, and this is just a few of the walls I did with the Pattern of Nature series. So one was a synagogue, one was the Army Medical, what was it? Medical Research Institute of Chemical Defense. Well, they probably made Agent Orange or something there. Anyway, I couldn't go anywhere near. This piece had to be shipped, but it was pretty long. And then the upper right-hand piece was something I did for the YWCA downtown when they did their remodeling. And this was all the donors and a description of all the services that the YWCA offered. My etcher etched parts, and I thought, well, I could make parts. So I made these flowers. I designed them on Illustrator and sent them the digital file, and they made a tool, which was like a positive and negative film, a film positive and a film negative, and they used this for photo etching. And then they would send me these different designs. I had two different patterns and like 4 or 5 different sizes that I made. And again, I would just say, give me, 6 3 inches and 4, in this pattern, and 5 10-inch ones in this pattern. And they'd send them to me, and they would just be these flat etched pieces. And then I would form them, drill them, put them on standoffs, and spray them different colors to look like different metals, because I couldn't keep all those different metals in stock. And this was done for the Mayo Clinic in Florida. And I would send a full template that the installer would lay out on the wall, and everything was coded. What standoff you used, which flower, which one was in front of which, the whole thing. So there was no problem installing this stuff. And I would design this whole thing on the wall in my studio, and thank God I had a 40-foot wall in my studio to do a piece like this. So sometime between, in the 2010s, this organization started. It was called Creative Arts of Women. And I thought, wow, this sounds really great. This is a way for me to like do some personal work. And so I went back, of course, to my dresses. I kept on going back because that was kind of my origin story. And I found these 2 dresses that were like dresses I probably had in grade school. And then there were 2 shows. This was an inside and an outside show. One was inside Columbus, one was outside Columbus. And these talked about, the one on the left talked about, how it's important how you looked on the outside, not about the inside. These were placed on antique quilts a friend of mine's grandmother made out of her old dresses. And she gave me these quilts that were kind of in tatters, which I used as my background. And then I appliqued the dress on top, and then put a shim over it, another fabric shim over it. And the one on the right talked about how you weren't supposed to, talk about sex at all. Like, so the breasts and the uterus are cut out of that dress. And you could just see the mother's influence through the holes, the grandmother's influence, what was passed down generation after generation of, how you should treat your sexuality. So those were those 2 pieces. And I was excited about working with fabric again. Of course, I worked with a million different materials, but on the left-hand side, you'll see 4-foot squares of etched industrial felt. This was for a client that was doing environmental work, and they wanted something to do with nature, but they also had a very modern feel to it. So I developed some designs that would kind of maybe look like if you were flying in a plane and you looked down and you saw patterns in farmland or rivers or oceans or ice. You might see these as a flyover. And I had these etched into industrial felt and mounted on wood and shipped to the client. So here I got to work with my laser cutter and then with fabric. So then over COVID, they were working and they would throw all their extra cutoffs into a dumpster. And I started dumpster diving for this industrial felt. And I brought it home and I put it on a laser cut piece, seeing what were the limits of working with industrial felt, and also trying to just make a quilt out of it. I know we're starting to run out of time. These are, I learned how to print fabric. I made some quilts. I tried to dimensionalize the quilt. I started making jean jackets. In 2 months, I was in Moab. I brought my sewing machine and thrifted jean jackets and fabric that I printed. And I sold a couple hundred of these jean jackets, just testing out what I would do after I retired from my sculpture business, and printed fabric, made clothes out of it. And then this is a show I had this spring at the downtown library called Speaking Volumes. The one on the left was using metal and quilted forms, and the one on the right were actual book covers I pulled out of the dumpster at half-price books, quilted together and sewed onto industrial felt. Now here we are at a common thread. I took Sue's fabric and I made a dress out of it, but I knew it needed me in there as well as Sue. So I went ahead and used the industrial felt to make a train and a cape, and I glued little jewels onto there. So it was a combination of heavy and light, ethereal and solid. On that piece also talked about women piecing things together. That was women's work, and the dress was hand sewn together with thread I found from Sue's other pieces. And then I felt I wanted to do another piece, and I went back to my Eve series and made jellyfish, but this time included fiber. Here's my studio. Here's what it looks like inside. I am now teaching in my studio and some other locations. Here's some classes I have in my studio, printing, dyeing, fabricating out of copper. And this was a class I did at the Ohio Craft Museum where I was done making jackets for people. I felt it was time to teach other people how to make jackets. And that's really what my mission is now, is to have people discover their own creativity in classes. So that's it.
Linda,
Thank
that
you.
was so great. That was really great. Folks, just a reminder, if you have questions, pop them into the comments and we'll get to them. So there are, applause, yes. You are a voracious learner, obviously. And I love that you talk about your experience in college, like recognizing and honoring what your family asked for, but also this need for lots of change. That the experience at UC kind of really echoes the rest of your life. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of connection and how that set you up for success and not being afraid to try new things?
Well, the work study experience at the University of Cincinnati made me, I never quite got comfortable anywhere. I had new experiences constantly, and new apartments, new cities, new people all the time. And when I was in school, I was always looking over at the industrial design wood shop and thinking, well, why can't we use the wood shop, Or I would see the fashion design department and go, well, why couldn't we work in fabric? And really, because I really wanted to be an artist. And so I did much of my fine art training on my own by taking a class at a local quilt shop, or um, getting a book out. I taught myself how to etch. I knew a woman who did etching, and I said, where do you get your supplies? She told me. I ordered them. I got a book. I sat down. I figured out how to etch. And And I really like that. And now living in this atmosphere where you can teach yourself anything by watching YouTube. Um, I've, I've learned a lot of stuff. In fact, I had a class, thought I was teaching upcycling, which is really where my heart lies right now is upcycling. And they listed the classes beginning sewing and upcycling. And so I thought, oh, okay, everybody here does not know how to use a sewing machine. So I went on YouTube and I figured out some different patterns I could give them, and I taught them beginning sewing, which I had never really done before, but I just had to keep a step ahead of them. So yeah, my early school kind of kept me shifting all the time. And I guess I just had a desire to work in a number of different materials.
So Linda, I kind of count that as three distinct moments of liberation in your art career. So one through school, that kind of liberation of from a set idea of exactly how it ought to go. Two, there was that person in Chicago that said there is no escape, only resolution. I see that in your work at every corner. And then the very last one that you just mentioned, which was if I need to learn it, I'll pick up a book and go. So I guess my question to you is for folks who have fear to be experimental or jump, that have, wonderings and maybe a hunger for it, what's your recommendation to help them?
I think you make mistakes because I learned my best solutions by making a lot of mistakes. Um, I call them tossers. You make something and you really thought you were doing it the right way, but as you were doing it, you learned a better way to do it. But so you put that one down and start the next one, and not to, feel discouraged or ashamed about it because I say to my students, you don't learn to make a mistake because if you did everything right, all you're doing is following a step by step. But this way you really can delve into, how your mind problem solves. Because really, every one of my pieces was solving a problem. And so I love it when somebody gives me a challenge, like, can you do this? Like the Sue Kavanaugh show, can you take a piece of Sue's fabric and make a piece of art out of it? Well, yeah, okay. And in my art group, where we all pretty much accepted the challenge, we would have many discussions about, well, what are you doing with it? Well, I'm a woodworker. I don't know what to do with it. Or I'm a painter. I don't know what to do with it. And so we all talk about it. It was great. And Sue herself was very inventive and used many different materials in her art. So she was a perfect example of using a lot of different materials and solving problems all the time with her material.
Exactly. That's a perfect dovetail. I want you to talk a little bit about the importance of community. So you talked just now a bit about kind of the hand in hand conceptual material approaches that you both have, very different voices, artistic voices that you melded really beautifully. But the other piece to that you've mentioned multiple times with uh, great fondness is the importance of your community of artists, your critique group. Can you chat a bit more about that?
Um, I spent a lot of early years by myself, just trying to figure stuff out. And I would have somebody I met come in, well, look at this. What do you think of this? But I needed somebody who like understood art terms or who understood critiquing or, like where you might get stuck. And over the years in Columbus, I have been in three different art groups where we can talk about it. We used to get together in person, but over COVID, Zoom happened, which made it so much easier because you could connect with people all over the country. We have somebody in Connecticut and somebody in Portland in our group. They used to live here in Columbus, but we can all still talk, and we've developed respect for each other's work and you know, just, a way to talk to each other and listen to each other. Because sometimes you just need to talk and you just need somebody to listen to you talk about your piece. And then they might reflect back to you, well, Linda, isn't that about this? Or did you think of trying this? Or I like this, but it looks like it needs to go further, maybe. Are you thinking of taking it further? I mean, it really helps, really helps.
Wonderful. We have all sorts of comments that sing your praises. We have one question in here that is curious about the work in the Architectural Journal and whether that helped you to receive commissions for public art as well.
Oh, tons, tons. That was the thing that being in that catalog, which I did for a number of years, um, I met I worked with so many people I never met in person. Mostly it was email and phone conversations. And then I'd send sketches and samples and they'd approve or just, or say no, I go further or whatever. But without that Guild source book, I don't know how I would have really gotten things jump started. The internet, people were just starting to put their websites up, and um, clients like to look at a printed thing, not necessarily at a screen. That Guild source book turned into CodaWorks, and I don't know if anybody's heard about it, but it's now an international art site that an artist can buy a page on and put a number of photos in and a description of their work and change their work all the time. But it has people making the most fantastic things, like people from China or Australia or South America doing these incredible things. But then it has also people making art for somebody's home, for a more intimate setting. There's all kinds of artists on there. It's a great resource. I did that for a while, but I'm no longer on that site. I'm just working off of my website, and really my goal is to teach now and to teach upcycling. So that's where I'm at.
I love that. This is a really natural place for us to kind of wrap up. But Linda, I would love to ask you one last question, just as a kind of a capstone to this wonderful talk. What do you want to leave the viewers and fellow artists with at the end of your talk?
Keep making art and use it as a point of self-discovery and not as something for somebody else to judge.
Perfect. Thank you all again for joining us for this wonderful artist talk. Linda, thank you for the generosity of your time and talent. This is a part of our programming for the exhibition, A Common Thread. Special thank you to our curators, Karen and Shar, as well as to the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone and have a great day.
Thank you.